Okay, seniors, we'll get going here and talk about diplomatic and military powers of the president today, as well as our legislative and judicial powers. So when we start talking diplomatic powers, whenever you're talking diplomacy, it refers to dealing with foreign nations. So in this case, the president does have the power to make treaties. A treaty, again, is a formal agreement between two or more nations. And again, when it's formal, it means that it has to also be approved by the Senate. Okay, so in order for any treaty agreement between the United States and a foreign nation to be actually become a treaty recognized by the United States, 2/3 of the U.S. Senate has to approve it. So 67 of our 100 senators. Generally speaking, our Secretary of State, one of the president's cabinet members, will do the most of the negotiating when it comes to creating a treaty. The Secretary of State deals mostly with foreign nations, and sometimes will, negotiate on part of the president. So understanding that. President also has the power to make an executive agreement. An executive agreement is very similar to a treaty, except there is no Senate approval required. So it's less formal, I guess you could say. And these will tend to change from presidential administration to presidential administration. Executive agreement is kind of to a treaty as an executive order is to a law, right? Might have a similar effect as a treaty, just like an executive order might have a similar effect to a law, except because there is no Senate approval here, it is less formal. And then our final diplomatic power is the power of recognition, and this is the power of the president to acknowledge the existence of other countries. So, for example, the nation of Kosovo, right, located out in Eastern Europe, within the country of Serbia, is not recognized by other nations as being its own nation. It's been kind of a controversial place. However, the United States recognizes Kosovo as an independent nation state. Same can be said about Israel. Israel is, again, a Middle Eastern nation. It was created as a safe haven for the Jewish population, right? The United States, obviously one of our biggest allies is Israel, but other nations do not recognize Israel as a legitimate nation, i.e. Palestine, right? So understanding that the president has the power to formally recognize the existence of other nation states. Getting into our military powers, the president is, as named by the Constitution, the commander-in-chief of our military. The president also has a lot of military advisors who will help the president make military choices. But really, to some degree, the military powers of the president are somewhat limitless almost, just because of, the way that conflicts have happened in the United States has been involved in really since Vietnam. I mean, most of the wars that we have been involved in our history, it seems like, have been undeclared wars. And, so the president cannot declare war on his own. That's something that Congress has to do. But the president holds a lot of military power because how the commander-in-chief is defined in the Constitution, it really isn't, other than it says the president's commander-in-chief, meaning that he can make a lot of military decisions with the exception of declaring a formal war on his own, really. So again, most of our conflicts that we have been involved in here in recent years, again, have been undeclared. Okay, most wars that the United States has fought in history, I'd say, have been undeclared wars. So, more recent conflicts like the Korean War in the 50s, Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, and the Middle East really since, like the 1980s, 1990s, those are all undeclared. Congress has never formally declared war on those. And nonetheless, you hear about military strikes and military operations, all the time. So keep that in mind as well as we go on here. The Congress has made attempts to limit the power of the president. And the other thing we got to talk about here is congressional resolutions, which are basically, these are congressional statements that kind of allow the president to extend war powers in places like, say, the Middle East. And again, when it comes to limiting the military powers of the president, Congress in 1973 passed the War Powers Act, having to do with a lot of what was going on in Vietnam, where the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration had done some things, kind of secretively, bombing campaigns and such. And so when the Vietnam conflict comes to an end or close to an end, Congress passes this War Powers Act that places a limit on the presidential military powers. And it specifically focuses on how long U.S. military forces can occupy an area without a formal declaration of war. So according to that War Powers Act, it's 60 days. Now, that's how long our military can stay in a place where war has not been formally declared. However, like we said, the United States, we've had a military presence in the Middle East since the early 90s. So you might ask, well, how does that work? Well, congressional resolutions. President can make an argument that there's danger, that maybe there was some sort of operation carried out against the U.S. military, which then maybe allows them to continue to extend operations there. The United States now also has military bases in the Middle East where we conduct military operations and general military business. So, there's been all kinds of loopholes with this, but the War Powers Act, is viewed as being Congress putting a limit on the presidential military power. However, it's, you can argue it's been largely unenforced just because of, recent events and history. Okay, getting into our legislative and judicial powers. So looking at how the president interacts and powers that they have that influence lawmaking and the judicial process as well. So one of the big legislative powers the president has, according to the Constitution, is the State of the Union address that is given every year, in which the president is supposed to update the Congress on things going on in the United States and goals that the president hopes to accomplish within the next year. That's a major legislative thing, or a way that the president, I should say, influences the legislative branch of the president, telling Congress to get laws passed, involving or having to do with immigration or education or spending, whatever it might be. That's a major influence. Okay, and again, remind you that the State of the Union address is when the House and the Senate meet together, the president speaks. It's all formally broadcasted now, and it's usually a pretty big deal. But that is one of the president's powers through which they can influence the legislative branch. Others, we talk about, approving and disapproving legislation, proposed laws. President has the power to sign bills into law, the power to veto laws. We talk pocket veto, which again is where the president doesn't act on a bill within 10 days. Congress dismisses. Assuming 10 days pass, the bill is vetoed. And then the line item veto, which is something presidents do not currently possess. Line item veto would be like with the president if he takes a red pen and crosses out parts of a bill that he doesn't like, but only vetoes those parts and not other parts, where they say, I want some of this, but not all of it. President can't do that. There have been presidents who have tried and presidents who have argued that they should have that power. However, it is not something that is widely accepted. But if sign, veto, pocket veto, you should be okay here. Other legislative powers, the president does have the power to call a special session of Congress. Hasn't been used since the Truman administration in the 1940s, when Harry Truman was kind of put on blast by the Republican Party for wartime inflation and things of that nature. But the president can call the House and the Senate into a special session. He can call just the House or just the Senate. However, but again, it has not been used since the late 1940s. The president also has the power to adjourn Congress. So as in, if Congress can't agree to what day that they're going to end their session, the president can give them the date and end it for them. And again, those are all ways in which the president can influence, legislation. So think, if there's a bill coming up, the president doesn't really want to act on it. Technically, the president could adjourn Congress and not have to act on that bill. Judicial powers, and our last couple of things here. So again, these are ways that the president can influence the judicial branch and our judicial system. And really there's 4 things the president can do that can influence this through reprieve, pardon, commutation, and amnesty. Okay, so, and what's interesting about these is that these are unchecked. Like Congress cannot block a pardon. Congress cannot block a reprieve or a commutation. Those are like kind of an all-powerful area for the president because there's no check on it. Now, does that mean presidents pardon and reprieve all the time? No, you generally see them do it more towards the end of their terms. But with watching the Tiger King the other day and how Joe Exotic is now asking for a pardon from President Trump. President Trump could pardon him. And that means complete forgiveness of the crime. Joe Exotic, if he were to be pardoned, he would be released from prison right then and there. Done deal. Doesn't matter if he's served 6 months of his 22 years or not, he's done. Okay, that's a pardon. Reprieve is when the sentence is postponed. So let's say, going back to Joe Exotic and the Tiger King, if you haven't seen it, it's interesting. But anyways, and kind of graphic. But if President Trump wanted to issue a reprieve to Joe Exotic, what that would mean is that, let's say Joe Exotic had to report to jail on January 1st, okay, just for the sake of argument. President Trump could have issued a reprieve that would say, okay, instead of having to report on January 1st, we're going to give you until December 31st, right, the end of the year rather than the beginning of the year. We're going to give you 11 more months of freedom, essentially, or however. That's reprieve, okay? Pardon, again, is complete forgiveness. And again, this is unchecked. The only thing that has to happen, other than the president issuing these, the only thing that has to happen for this to go into effect is the person who is receiving it has to accept it. Where let's say you have somebody sitting in jail, prison for some crime, receives a presidential pardon for whatever reason, maybe because there's some wrongdoing or a questionable trial, whatever, any number of factors. If that person doesn't accept it, it doesn't go into effect. So, however, again, like I said, Congress cannot block this. Judicial branch can't block it. It's kind of a total power for the president, this reprieve, pardon, and then commutation would be reducing a sentence. So let's say that somebody gets, like Joe Exotic, again, gets sentenced to 22 years in prison. President Trump could say, I think that's too many. I'm going to give him 2 years. He can do it. Okay, he's the president. So, and those are talked about, mentioned in the Constitution. Now, the only thing that these do not apply to is impeachment cases. So like in the case of President Trump, when he was impeached, he could not pardon himself from that. That is in the Constitution. Or let's say a Supreme Court justice gets impeached. The president cannot pardon them from that because an impeachment is not a criminal case, and it's explicitly written into the Constitution that these judicial powers do not apply in the case of an impeachment. So really interesting. Okay. And then amnesty, again, it's kind of like a blanket pardon when the president, gives a bunch of people protection, say, like, let's say that there were people on the run from, say, the country of Mexico. Okay. Just for the sake of argument, because it's a country that borders us. And they were on the run for alleged wrongdoing. If the president wanted to, he could grant them amnesty in the sense that he would not probably extradite them to Mexico and not charge them with any crimes in the United States. Okay, and again, these judicial powers are absolute. If you guys have questions about this, this is the end of the chapter here. If you guys have any questions, please let me know.